Okay, I think it looks like everybody's there.
Yep.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Global Encounters and First Nations People, 1,000 Years of Australian History, our seminar for the month of April 2026. And I'm speaking to you from Naarm, the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people. And we're doing something very interesting tonight. We're launching a significant report that emerges out of Global Encounters, and we're doing a soft launch. And the reason we're doing a soft launch is because Leonie, who's going to speak to this big project that she's been wrapping up, is currently in South Korea. So we're very grateful to her for taking time out of her holiday to join us tonight. So I'm going to hand over to you, Leonie, and
Thank
I
you.
will mute myself. And this will probably go for about, what do you reckon, 35 minutes or so, and
Something
then
like that, yeah.
yeah,
40
and
minutes,
then
yeah.
I'll pop back in. Okay, bye.
Okay, just sharing my screen. Okay. Look, hi. I'm assuming you can see my screen and everything. Thank you for coming
Yep.
to mark the launch of this report. Excuse me if I cough a little bit. It's spring here. I want to begin by acknowledging that this report was produced on unceded Indigenous lands. I work on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong Kulin nations, and I live on beautiful Jara or Djadja land in Bendigo, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm speaking to you tonight from the other side of the world, latitude-wise, from the historic Silla capital of Gyeongju in Korea. The format for this I, I wanted to have that map up while I locate myself, and that's where I am. All right. Um, the format for tonight's presentation is simple. Some background into this report, the method of assembly, the choices around its structure, a few of the challenges, both in producing and in reading it, a couple of sample entries, and some final observations. All right, so this report is a synthesis of publicly available, mostly primary sources describing early encounters between First Nations Australians and those who came from the sea. While there are some entries from the colonial era up to about 1819, the main focus is the time period before British colonisation in 1788. The dual focus, as many of you all know, of the Global Encounters project, and the title of this report is Looking Out, Looking In. It's been our mantra from the start. We try to reflect multiple perspectives of encounters between First Nations and the outsiders, the view from the shore and the view from the ship. Often we only have one side of the encounter in the written record, but within that there are strong clues to the perspective of the undocumented other in their actions. And when we gather together multiple examples of the similar behaviour, clear patterns emerge. We use a broad definition of encounter. Encounters are fleeting and temporary. They take place up close, within arm's reach, or from a great distance. They can be curious, friendly, or hostile, sometimes all within a few moments. They might be inspired by scientific inquiry or the desire to conquer, altruism, or murderous intent. The key way that encounters differ from other forms of contact between First Nations peoples and strangers is that the visitors don't stay. They might come ashore for as little as minutes to as long as weeks and then go away, with each party carrying with it a record or a memory of what transpired. There are the typical encounters taking place on a beach or between ships, where two parties stand face to face, communication is attempted, and goods or ideas are transferred. This might be documented in a ship's log, a report to the Admiralty, or a best-selling book. They can also be found in oral histories, stories, or song passed from one generation to the next. These encounters can be visible in rock art, bark paintings, or else in physical form in the archaeological sites. Yet there are many other types of encounter, and they don't all result in direct interpersonal contact. Indigenous signal fires seen from the deck of a Dutch or British ship are encounters of a kind. as are sightings from the shore of huge white sails of ships which don't even make landfall. There are cautious glimpses of strangers blundering along a beach or a riverbed, watched from a safe vantage point, or annual visits of friends who arrive with the trade winds, stay for a while, and then go. Some encounters leave profound traces across the length of the continent, such as the evidence for visits by Southeast Asian mariners from the port of Makassar, whereas some leave only silent, invisible traces. Introduced plants and animals, even diseases, constitute evidence of encounter, as do remains of canoes or surprising objects which appear vast distances from where they should be. The human protagonists in these encounters come from a wide range of locations, cultures, and languages. There are the Australian First Nations peoples from around 150 coastal nations, along with their inland neighbours. Others come from nearby places like New Guinea, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and broader Oceania, the Indonesian archipelago, and still others from Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, Scandinavia, the Indian subcontinent, China, the Arabian world, Eastern Africa, and Britain. These encounters placed Australian First Nations peoples within complex global trade networks centuries before the arrival of British colonising forces. So that's the background to the project, and that's all well and good. But when we started in April 2020, it was synchronous with the COVID pandemic. And being based in Naarm or Melbourne, we found ourselves locked down for the best part of 2 years, literally locked down in our houses or our streets and neighbourhoods. And the only way our team encountered each other was via Zoom. And this is the earliest Zoom snapshot I could find with our team. We have David, left clockwise from left, David, myself, Professor Russell, Lee Penman, Fikri, who was our Macassan in-country researcher at the time, and our beloved late Lily Yulianti Farid. So we're locked down. The only contact we have with each other is via Zoom. I had to do something, so as one often does, I started a spreadsheet. I based it on David Horton's iconic 1996 IATSIS map of Indigenous Australia. I listed coastal nations beginning in Lutruwita or Tasmania and worked counterclockwise around the continent. Each individual nation, I slowly populated it with information that was available to a desktop review. And you can see on this is the earliest one that I could find, doing some Excel archaeology from May 2020. You can see I have information about, it's all place-based and Indigenous nation-based. I collected encounters, locations, if there was any Indigenous record of encounter, outsider ones, monuments. So this was the fields that I slowly began to populate from May 2020. And it just sort of grew slowly through the length of the project. So the information gathered in this database was used as the basis of an interactive map designed in collaboration with our colleagues from Monash University's Faculty of Information Technology, including Tom Chandler, Daniel Waghorn, Min Dawberry, and others on their fantastic team. We were inspired, of course, by the University of Newcastle's Colonial Frontier Massacres map, which remains one of the great insightful uses of a clickable map in Australian history, I think. So we envisioned a clickable map with records of encounters between First Nations and outsiders. It quickly became apparent, however, that the scale of the encounters far surpassed any design abilities to include them in an online map. And we also wanted to do something, really kind of aesthetic as well with the IT team. So in the end, we had 45 individual encounters we chose as the sample ones from the database for the first iteration of the interactive map, and that went live in December 2023. And I'll just show you a sample of what it looked like. You can see we had animated, if you go to it, which some of you undoubtedly have, there's animated waters, there's animated ships that were designed by Min Dorbury, the coastline, the trees, the topography is all really thoughtfully produced in a sort of a video game design type thing. So by early 2025, as the official finishing date of the Global Encounters project loomed, we decided to look at ways that we could make the information gathered in that database publicly available for future researchers. A clickable map showing all the encounters was well beyond our technological abilities, so we decided to present it as a searchable PDF, similar to one that we produced about a year ago that was authored by Mike Rowland, which is available on Monash Indigenous Studies Centre's Bridges website repository. So we decided to go with that, despite the cumbersome size, and this runs to about 360 pages. There's 151 nations. There's almost 700 encounters. It still seemed like the easiest solution for researchers, students, and communities to be able to access it, search through, copy primary sources, and follow up references. So this report is the result. So it's deliberately written in plain English, avoiding academic jargon and specialised terminology. For example, down to things like, I don't say 18th century, I say 1700s. It's designed as a freely available educational resource for students and communities. Much of the material quoted is available online through sources like Project Gutenberg, libraries, or university research repositories, and every quote includes a link or a reference to the source document. It should be noted that different versions of some of the older texts, like things like Cook and Flinders, change depending on who was editing at the time, and there's been some really fantastic recent versions of these. But we decided to go with the ones that are either on Project Gutenberg or are available to the public so that anyone can access them. Yeah, and I also, there was minimal editing of or correction of the sources. So it's structured around the 1996 Horton-Iatsis map of Indigenous Australia. Each coastal nation has an entry which includes the nation or clan name, either which is used by contemporary descendants or else most common in the records. And as many of you will know, just the spelling and the naming is a really complex thing. There's a small map showing the approximate geographical location, and I've left that deliberately loose, and a brief summary of the location. Yeah, that they were left vague or general because many remain the subject of native title or Indigenous land use applications and are beyond the expertise of this report. It also contains information from IATSIS's Australian Languages database, showing how that particular nation name came to be used by linguists and anthropologists, and then us, often non-Indigenous scholars, where contemporary nations use a different name to what's on the Horton or IATSIS map. This is noted because I'm fully expecting people to use this report in concert with the very beautiful Horton IATSIS map. And I also try to include links to websites of Indigenous corporations or cultural organisations where they're known. These are included, or else the appropriate registered native title representative body. But a disclaimer, of course, I could be wrong about these. So that's sort of the entry for each nation. Each entry of an individual encounter includes a place name, a date, a brief introduction written by me, a historical or other kind of quote or image, the reference to where the reader can find it, and in a few cases, links to further reading. There's not much in the way of secondary sources in this because it's intended to be a reader of primary sources. So there are numerous nations where, for various reasons, there's no information on encounters or anything beyond linguistic data. This is especially true for areas in parts of Arnhem Land, Cape York Peninsula, and in western parts of northern Western Australia, where there was just very little information available to me anyway. For these, I've given the approximate location, language or anthropological data from IATSIS's Ostling database, or a native title body or representative body, if I can find it. And in a few cases, speculation. And for example, this one that I have on the screen, Nagara, I've speculated at the end that they would have witnessed probably at least some annual visits of Macassar and Trapangas over the centuries, though we don't have any information about that now. It was simply impossible, given the scope of this report, to offer significant historical detail about a lot of the nations. I keep the editorialising to a minimum. I try to avoid the pretense of objectivity. Sometimes they might come across as wry, judgmental, admiring, or disgusted. And that's probably how I felt when I was writing it. Sometimes all of those emotions all at the same time. As I mentioned earlier, on the project, we take a broad definition of the archive, and here we have just some of those, what we consider evidence of encounter, some examples: song, oral history, recording on rock, plants and trees that are introduced, animals that are introduced, diseases, remains of vessels, like in this wonderful photo that Mike Rowland found for us on his report. Sometimes shipwrecks, sometimes it's almost mythological stories. Tools that are where they shouldn't be. As I mentioned, smoke or fire seen across the water, footprints on the sand are often described by Europeans, and abandoned fires and housing, or the sight of people fleeing. In the context of this report, we consider all of these things evidence of encounter of a kind. But the vast majority of the evidence of encounter in this report are written records of interpersonal encounters written by Europeans. As such, it contains a significant amount of material which is of a distressing and confronting nature. And just quickly running through a few of these, it depicts widespread violence, which characterised some of the European explorations of First Nations coastal lands. We now clearly identify that as part of a genocidal process of settler colonialism. Violence is discussed in the source materials openly and without shame. In fact, there's often a sense of pride or heroism and what Patrick Wolfe called homicidal belligerence. Some, but not all, Europeans saw Indigenous peoples as commodities to be captured, maybe as a hindrance to exploration to be swiftly removed by any means necessary. They wrote and spoke openly about the methods they used. At times it's discussed even in a celebratory or humorous tone, which, is likely to be distressing for some readers. But equally disturbing to me anyway is the banal, matter-of-fact tone in which these records describe murder and kidnapping. The records also abound with offensive language and imagery, not so much the imagery, but definitely the language. A large part of this report is journal entries from Europeans recorded between the 1600s and the early 1800s, and they use what is today deeply racist terminology. Got to acknowledge that some of these terms were not at their time intended to be especially derogatory, but the vast majority were the product of sort of perceived racial superiority of the writers and the inferiority of the subjects. They're frequently disparaging and deeply racist attitudes towards Indigenous peoples. Some of the images that are produced are contained in this report, such as those illustrating Francois Perron's A Voyage of Discovery in the Southern Hemisphere, are quite problematic because they depict Indigenous peoples as primate-like. this would eventually become codified in the late 1800s in Darwinian hierarchies of evolution. Even comparatively sympathetic writers such as missionaries or early ethnographers or the scientific gentlemen, as I call them, saw Indigenous peoples through a doomed race lens, a lesser kind of human being. Terms which are now unacceptable rather, are reprinted here in their original form. So, I'm conscious that if this is used in schools, it will have to be, sort of introduced sensitively. There's also at times a lack of adherence to cultural protocols. And I know this as a non-Indigenous researcher and as a woman, I'm acutely aware of my problematic place in the gathering and presentation of some of the material in this report. There's often open discussion by some non-Indigenous writers and early ethnographers of what I suspect are culturally sensitive locations or practices. And even those who exhibited more sympathetic attitudes often write in derogatory terms. A bit of an example is the work of Norman Tyndale, whose decades-long study and his early prototype map actually enabled the Horton Iatsis map, which has become so iconic. But Tyndale's 1974 Aboriginal Tribes of Australia, while it's a masterpiece and it's so important, it also really abounds with some deeply offensive terminology and really, really problematic and insensitive photographs, for example. Text, at times I deliberately edited or omitted certain types of texts, mainly where there were textual depictions within quotations of Indigenous bodies, which are in the reports of Europeans. These descriptions were based on a nexus of European beauty ideals and racism, and they're often really deeply disturbing, sexualizing, and derogatory. To me, they serve little purpose in the context of the report of encounters, as they say more about the propensity of the writers to dehumanize Indigenous people and provide salacious reading material than they do about the encounters themselves. But in those cases, there's always links to the original source. So people can go and read the original source and look at what has been edited out, and that's signaled by ellipsis. At times, due to the ravages of settler colonialism, linguistic data might be the only information available about a people who, for survival, found it necessary to relocate or merge with neighbouring peoples. This is not to say the nation is gone, but rather that individuals, families, and communities took the necessary step to adapt to survive. For this reason, in this report, the descriptions of each nation's approximate geographical area are deliberately written by me in the present tense. This was a conscious decision, even in cases where members of a certain nation may not have been recorded on their traditional lands for a century or more. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land. The European sources, as every historian and probably many archaeologists and other scholars in the audience will know, they're not always reliable. They contain wildly varying spelling and abbreviations. Names of crew members are often spelled in different ways, often in the same paragraph. Probably a result of being scrawled quickly into notebooks and then transcribed by later historians. Many spelling errors or archaic or grammatical conventions have crept in. There's often confusion about locations. So certain geographical features, such as rivers, are given one name by the Dutch and then another by later visitors. In some cases, such as nations along Western Cape York Peninsula, this has led to decades of investigation by experts. And I can attest to this. The image on the screen is from when I was trying to plot the course of the Pera and the Arnhem, two Dutch ships which went down and then back up the coast in April, May 1623. Trying to work it out, I would have 15 tabs open. I had everything from the Dutch records, sort of all sorts of historical interpretations, fishing guides, trying to work out which river was where, gave me a migraine that lasted for days. I endeavoured to present in this report the most recent and correct information, but it's possible, well, nay, probable, that there are some errors. I've kept the spelling consistent with the historical sources. I don't draw attention to what we might now perceive as spelling errors by using the SIC alert. I find it personally disruptive and intrusive. In most cases, the reader can make sense of what's being said, basically, through the quotations. You can generally work out what they're getting across. I do provide a glossary, though. What can be harder to make sense of is the mindset of the authors in some of these texts. That's often one of the big challenges when looking at histories. It's essential to remember that European texts, which are quoted extensively in this report, were created by human beings with their own cultural baggage. And they arrived wholly invested with often with one central idea or a career ambition that was about how Indigenous people lived and might behave, but what they encountered might have been something completely different. And one clear example is the French naturalist Francois Perron, who is quoted extensively, especially in the Palua Tasmanian section of this report and in some of the Noongar and different West Australian areas. As Shino Kanishi beautifully noted about Perron, he was desperate to find the perfect noble savage. He never expected that his offerings and paternalistic guidance would be rejected, and he reacted with the vindictiveness of a rejected lover. We have to see and feel and experience their present to really be able to access anything approaching historical truth. We also need to read actions as texts, and I've got a couple of brief examples here. Oh, sorry. Before that, the existential problem, I guess, the major existential problem with putting together this report, and this will be familiar to many of you, is the imbalance between the view from the sea and the view from the shore. We have plenty of European sources on encounters, but less of the Indigenous side of the story, less of the view from the shore. They're there, but they're fewer and they're harder to access. One solution on this project, as I've mentioned, is expanding the definition of archive. Methodologically, I borrowed from historian Greg Denning his idea of representing the past. That is, viewing the individual encounters in the present tense, where neither participant knew the final outcome. This includes trying to keep in mind the hardships, ambitions, superstitions, human frailties, the cultural baggage, Perron's cultural baggage, of those who created the historical records. The European texts in this report were created by people who were often hungry, thirsty, homesick, sometimes physically ill, sometimes mentally ill. There was often tension between the regular ship's crews and their captains on one side and the scientific gentlemen on the other side, the naturalists, botanists and artists who created a lot of these records. They created a lot of the richest records we have. The crews saw them as wasting time and valuable resources on the ships. All of these records need to be seen in the context of their creation. Like I said, we have to feel their present. We need to read their actions as texts, which is what we'll do now. And this is just a couple of little examples. This is one that I think Lynette might have mentioned a couple of weeks ago, actually. Matthew Flinders, young Matthew Flinders, he was in his early 20s, arrives at Nalika, Twofold Bay, on his trip with George Bass to go and try and find Bass Strait in 1798. It's a fabulous quote, one of our favourites here. There's a lot of things happening in this quote, but I want to just draw attention to three little aspects. And it's a little story that they're on the beach, three women um, in great consternation scream and run off. And I think consternation is an interesting word because it implies they're angry. Um, the careless confidence of a senior man who arrives, and the diplomacy with both of the parties when they swap food and they taste each other's food. Neither finds it palatable, and they both sort of look to really diplomatically spit the food out when no one's looking. Um, there's a lot happening in this. The line that I keep coming back to is the careless confidence. I imagine this bloke coming up with swagger. There's he's not he's not nervous, he's not scared of Flinders, and I think this is a really quite a beautiful little interaction with that much can be made of and read into this interaction, even though we only have Flinders' side of it. There was none of that sensibility in the next example, which is one that many of you may know of. William Dampier wrote much on his, and much I mean incredibly lengthy quotes, which take up pages and pages of this report at times, but it's so rich, and his writing was so informative because it was Dampier's work that James Cook and Joseph Banks and Matthew Flinders and a lot of the Europeans who later came to Australia, they'd read Dampier, and so Dampier really informed them. And there's an incident at Sunday Island where Dampier and the crew he's part of are on land searching for that most precious resource, water. They're loading it up into barrels. There's three Jawi or perhaps Bardi men who are standing there watching them, doing all this labour. Dampier gives, or, some of the crew give these men, some clothes, and Dampier admits that they're rags, they're not valuable clothes or anything. The men sort of, indifferently put the clothes on, and then Dampier and his men try to get these Jawi men to carry barrels of water to the canoe to be taken back to the ship. And it's a very famous quote. We tried to show them what to do, but they just stood there and grinned like so many monkeys, staring upon one another. For me, this is one of the most visual stories in this whole report. The men standing there like, are they crazy? I often hear my dear old dad's voice saying, "You'd be joking." That they're not going to work like that for nothing, for a few rags. There, this is actually, to me, so easy to read, so vivid. I think it's fantastic, but you have to read through a lot of Dampier's really insensitive and horrible writing. I can just feel these Jawi fellows standing there, saying that, and perhaps it plays into like James C. Scott's Weapons of the Weak, some of his ideas as well about sometimes Indigenous people or subjugated people will pretend to be stupid or pretend not to understand, because that's an act of resistance. But, to me, ultimately, it's a fundamental misreading by Dampier of their actions. And another example of that I enjoy, early on I got to thinking a lot about Cook and all of his many quotes about smoke, or smook, he wrote. And he saw, upon his first sight of Yuin country. It should be added that he was probably seen well, the Endeavour was probably seen well before they saw the coast, or any people. There's a story from the Gunai Kurnai at Bunjil Nooruk who heard the guns firing and saw the sails. But Cook and Banks often talk about smoke or smook seen. And to make sense of it for me, I made an animation, but I'm just going to click through it here. These were all the locations that Cook reported seeing smook. as they went along the coast over a couple of week period. Um, Almost certainly, it was a messaging system that was alerting neighbours to it. It's just some final observations because I know I'm running out of time. This report is by no means comprehensive or complete. As I've said, the view from the shore, Indigenous perspectives are not as readily available as the view from the ship. The vast majority of sources are European or visitor perspective. I've probably missed some stories as well. I've used art, imagery, creative writing, performance produced in recent decades as contemporary commentary, but also indicative of the enduring role of oral histories in retaining encounter stories. Likewise, commemoration or monuments and reenactments are an indicator of what stories are culturally appropriate. So despite the limitations of a historical record heavily weighted towards European perspective, certain trends became clear as I was putting this together. Some of these are quite obvious and already well documented, but I think they bear repeating. I'm just going to run through them quickly now. Encounters were almost always on terms dictated by First Nations peoples. They were the ones to choose where and when to approach and make themselves known. And that's one of the reading actions aspects that really comes through constantly, again and again and again in this. They were almost always men to men or warrior to warrior. Women and children and the elderly, sometimes, very few times, were they chanced upon by the outsiders. Usually they were hidden safely away. The men were usually armed or had weapons or backup very close by. And as I mentioned, First Nations people were very rarely surprised. The encounters were dictated by them. They knew the outsiders were coming. They could see them, they could hear them, they could smell them from afar. And they relayed the news to each other through extensive fire messaging systems and other ways to alert their neighbours that people were coming. First Nations people made meaning of the ships through their own worldviews. So, birds are a constant when in First Nation stories of seeing the tall sails, birds are one of the common depictions. It looked like a giant bird. The Yuin had a story about a greedy pelican. Floating Island is another depiction of the sails of the tall ships. I think First Nations people didn't always think that outsiders were ghosts or returning spirits. Sometimes they did, but that's not a universal. A lot of the time they knew they were human. They just thought they were grotesque humans with weird skin hanging off them and stuff like that, which was clothing. Exposure of genitalia was important. That sort of part of the meeting process. You had to work out if you're men or women. That's a common trait across the encounters. And both First Nations and outsiders, contemporary settler colonial Australia, we commemorate encounters in places where the encounters probably didn't take place. Our friend Erin Parker wrote a great news article about the Cook dance in the Kimberley, a traditional dance around Captain Cook's arrival in the Kimberley, where he never arrived. And monuments and replicas far from contact points. We've got the Doifken at the National Maritime Museum in Sydney, where the Dutch and the Doifken never sailed. We've got monuments to Tasman in Salamanca Place, where he never arrived. Encounters took place not just on beaches, but on bays, rivers and estuaries in the hinterland. They were multinational. It wasn't the British meeting the Gadigal. Ships might have flown a flag of empire, but the crews were really complex. They were very, very multicultural. And shore parties often included interpreters. So interpreters might have been bought from um, other areas. From famous case of Tupaya, who travelled with Cook, but they possible interpreters were brought from the Cape Colony to Australia. So they're very multicultural. And food was one of the chief items of exchange. There were also the purpose-bought gifts and trinkets. Red caps were really popular. Flinders gave away a lot of the red woolen caps right along the coast of New South Wales and Queensland. And in many cases, the gifts were actually discarded by Indigenous peoples. There's many reports of the goods that were given being found neatly packaged up and just left. People either found no use for them or didn't trust them. Finally, to finish up, I just want to reiterate, bears repeating, that this report was assembled by an imperfect researcher using imperfect information from imperfect sources. And, myself as an individual and the project, we do apologise for any distress caused by inaccurate identifications of lands, peoples or encounters. Our goal here was to be a useful beginning, and it would be great to come along in 10 years and do a much more expanded version of this report. But I hope those of you who look at it get something useful out of it, because that's what we want it to be useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. That's great. Now,
I'll stop sharing.
Yes, please stop sharing. That would be terrific. Excellent. And thank you for doing this from Korea.
Jeonju. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Just letting everyone know, I'm just putting a link in the chat to Monash Indigenous Studies Centre's research repository, where you can read and download the Leonie's report.
And on that link is also, you will find, I think it's on the same link, is it, David?
Yeah.
That the report that Mike Rowland did for us on the East Coast. And these two resources sit together. They're really a really significant part of what we've been doing over the last few years. And I'm just going to take a microsecond of time to do a little skite, because, and I know at least one person on the chat today will be excited to see this. I think, Katie, you were there. I saw Katie's name a moment ago. But we've just got the mock-up of the cover of the whopping big Palgrave Handbook of Global Oceanic Encounters, as David and I would like it to be through history, but Palgrave has insisted on throughout. So I'll stop my share. I think we've got a couple of potentially a question. Oh no, that's David. Fantastic. Yes, Katie.
I was supporting.
So we can open it up to questions, and anybody's got any comments. It's really exciting to see it come to this point. But I think, Leonie's very humble in saying, and it's an imperfect thing by imperfect researcher. It's a spectacular piece of research by somebody who's really worked very hard and put a lot of effort in. And it's not just the effort of collating and collecting the information, it's the effort of really thinking about how we can make these sources useful. So I'm going to open it up and see if anybody would like to have a comment or ask a question. Unfortunately, David, I can't see everybody. I don't know why. Oh, hang on, maybe if I do that. Nope, I can only see 4 people.
Yeah, no, I'm the same.
I see. Yep, okay. Sorry, I got it now. I think most people have got their screens turned, their cameras turned off, so that's all right.
Yeah.
Ian McNiven has a question and a comment. Thank you very much, Ian. Would you like to pop your screen? Oh, your camera on. There he is.
Okay. So, hi Leonie, hi everybody. Greetings from, in fact, Bachelor country. So it's where you started. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and just a couple of days ago, I was on the outer beach of the back beach of Gari, sort of looking out to sea, sort of thinking about, yeah, those ships sailing by, and yeah, so
Yeah.
it's lovely to see your presentation, and it was a beautiful presentation. You have a very melodic way of speaking. It's very engaging. So thank you. But yeah, I think you. Boy, you're being very modest. It's just overwhelming, obviously, the amount of work that you have done on this. It's quite extraordinary. So I'm dying to see the actual report. So, and I guess I've got a couple of sort of questions. You've did a bit of a summary at the end there, but I'm wondering, you could almost do like a quantification of the different types of encounters, of how many of them were about sort of exchanges of objects, how many of them involved sort of, the different genders of people meeting, how many were violent, friendly, just sort of almost sort of quantifying because you've got such a big database.
Look,
So,
that would be my dream. That would be the next step, actually, to do some sort of typology of encounters, actually, to look at which animals, it's usually birds who are represented, which how many how many encounters did people did men come armed, and how many weren't they armed, things like that. So yeah, it actually makes it possible. I toyed with the idea of doing it like an enormous Excel spreadsheet with this information on it. But I'm not that good with Excel. I tend to think more in a more linear way, which is why I ended up doing it in a searchable PDF. But it could be done. This could, a lot of those questions could be asked because it's searchable. Like you could put in a keyword and search through it that way.
yeah, well,
But yeah,
it seems
to
like
look at the typology. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
or even if, I mean, if you could create sort of quantified, like I say,
Yeah.
create graphs of different things. Because, like, if you don't, you've created such an extraordinary resource. I know other people will do it. So I'd hate to see them sort of like, in a sense, steal your thunder, given that you've
Oh, I
done
don't
so
care.
much work,
Yeah, no, look,
So,
yeah, look, it'd be really interesting to do that. But look, I
mm,
just wanted to work out a way that, so this project has a major output, in that way. Yeah. So, but the idea is that it's there for people to come along and do other stuff as well,
very generous of you.
so.
So,
And Tammy is online. Hi, Tammy. You must be in Brisbane. So that's wonderful. Thank you. And Tammy just wanted to express her gratitude. But this is a good opportunity for me to do a little segue here because
Mhm.
we're heading back to Macassar in 3 weeks' time. It's getting very quick, very
Oh
soon.
my God.
And we've got one of the things that we've been working on is creating what we're calling the Meregge reader. And it's going to be it's a Google Drive resource, which is for our colleagues and friends in Macassar, but elsewhere as well, of course, which lists all of in a sense, all the outputs that we've created from this project, but with a specific focus for the Indonesian section. So one of the things Leonie did before she hopped on the plane to Seoul was she actually has extracted all of the Indonesian fishing interactions and encounters across Northern Australia from the report. And we've got that, we're sitting that separately. That'll sit as a separate entry on the Google Drive that we're giving. And we're going to be making a few hard copies as well. And we're making posters. And in fact, we just got a poster then, just came through. So there's lots of things, lots of activity. The idea being trying to create a legacy going
Yeah.
forward. But importantly as well, it's really critical. The work we do has really been about giving back. So we wanted to give back to Aboriginal communities, but also to the Macassan communities, and be able to say, well, here's what we've done, and hopefully this is of value and use to you as well. So,
And look, that's what I wanted to do with this report as well. I wanted to make it perhaps a usable document for schools, certainly for university, especially first year university, but, upper high school as well, a searchable document so people could go and look at their area, their town, if they're on the coast, and find those resources. It's
Yeah.
part of it, it's the democratization of information and knowledge. That's
Yeah.
one of the goals behind this. Yeah. And I think the Global Encounters project generally. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
And Mike Rowlands just said perfect insights, Leonie. So obviously,
Thank you,
big
Mike.
thumbs up there. Big thumbs up. Well, no one seems to be offering any questions, so what I might
I could
do.
offer another one if you've got
Oh,
time.
please. Yeah, we do have time.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Leonie, about like some of the information from Torres Strait, where you almost have these sort of ghost first encounters, where the first recorded encounter is sometimes violent, and some of the interpretations are that in fact that was a response to an earlier encounter
Mm,
that went unrecorded. So is there a
mm.
sense with some of the first recordings that you have that people have suggested maybe the way that the communities were responding, that in fact there had been somebody there before them, and
Yeah,
that
look,
that's changing the nature of the interaction. So yeah, these sort of ghost first encounters in a sense.
look, absolutely with the Torres Strait, there's I can't think of it now. Bligh in 1772, I think. One of Bligh's first trips through. I can't remember which island he visits, but there's a violent interaction. But we know that 150 years before that, Torres had gone through Torres Strait, and we know that people had been kidnapped from certain,
Mm,
women had been kidnapped.
mm,
A group, quite horrendous
mm,
reports that are, just blithely discussed in Tovar's Relation. Um, yeah, the knowledge of like that. Perhaps it was the Taurus journey, but there could have been others as well that
mm,
we don't know about though. But yeah, the Taurus journey that could be seen as a
mm,
ghost journey. But yeah, with with the Bligh one, I can't from the top of my head think of the island, but it was really different to other reports of, when people approached the Mur or Murray Island, people
mm,
rode out, ready to trade. They already had the goods ready and everything. There was no fear or apprehension at all.
mm. Yeah.
So yeah, there definitely was probably other journeys that went through there that led to this effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who knows what the Dutch
Yeah.
did too, the Dutch, kept a lot of their records hidden, but
Mm.
generations of scholars have poured over it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I reckon, yeah, definitely around Torres Strait, the Torres, that journey in
Mm.
1606,
Yep.
1605.
Six. Yep.
Yeah, we don't know exactly where,
Mm.
we can guess which of those islands off the coast of New Guinea he went to and kidnapped people and killed people.
Mm.
But yeah,
Mm.
that information would have spread across Torres Strait without a doubt. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to, I think what we might do, David, I might get you to put up our last slide.
Yeah. I just posted the link to the registration link to our next
Yeah.
seminar.
Next seminar's in I think it's the 28th of May from memory. And that's Ian McNiven is going to be discussing Sentient Seas, his new book, and we're going to have because the time difference is a little bit tricky, so we're actually going to have a recorded response from Professor Victor Thompson at University of Atlanta, Georgia. And next month, as I said, we're off to Macassar. We're going to be talking, both Ian McNiven and I are talking at the Macassar International Writers Festival. And then I'm also doing apparently a TED style talk on which is again on sea and encounters, and then in June we'll have our final seminar. We will have the occasional seminar going forward, but this will be the sort of the final formal seminar, which will be to really explore everything that Global Encounters has done over the last 5 years or 5 and a bit years, and make people aware of the sorts of things and the ways, the sorts of resources and things that are out there and available. So I'll talk about some of the articles we've written and obviously this new massive handbook that we've got coming out. So keep an eye out for those and please do register, and keep looking at the Global Encounters website for interesting things coming up. So I think that's us for today. Thank you so much, Leonie. I really appreciate it. It's pretty lovely to do that when you're on your holiday. So
Look,
Thank you, Leonie.
we don't take holidays. I've spent the entire holiday going to archaeological sites. So.
exactly. What do they call it? It's a busman's holiday, where
Yeah,
he gets on the bus and goes to different
Yep.
bus stops. All right. Okay, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leonie.
Yeah.